begin.
Good afternoon, Festival, and welcome to this panel discussion, which is part of the Pearson Keynote panel series at this year's festival. I'm Mann, the festival director, and I'll be chairing this afternoon's panel. During the next 50 minutes, we'll be discussing the cost of the gender gap post-COVID if we don't act now. The impact of COVID-19 has been devastating for many, with far-reaching economic and social consequences. Evidence is increasingly pointing to a widening gap as existing inequalities have been deepened and new ones have been created. We know that access to learning and skills is a powerful enabler for economic growth and social mobility. As we emerge into a post-COVID world, the role of education, learning, reskilling will be even more crucial in helping people to make progress in their lives and in restarting the economy. In this session, I will be joined by expert witnesses about the impact COVID has had on women, on their access to learning, to the labour market, and on their well-being. Joining me now, we have Cindy Rampersaud, the Senior Vice President for BTEC and Apprenticeships at Pearson, David Hughes, the CEO of the Association of Colleges, and Denise Wilson, the CEO of the Hampton-Alexander Review. And for those not familiar with the review, it was an independent, voluntary and business-led initiative supported by government to increase the representation of women in senior leadership positions and on boards of FTSE 350 companies. In February, the fifth and final report of the review was published. I'd like to start by asking our panel to briefly, in 60 seconds, introduce themselves and explain how their roles are important in addressing the gender gap. If we could start with Denise, please.
Thank you, Shane. So Denise Wilson, good afternoon, everyone. My role is as Chief Executive of the Hampton-Alexander Review, which is the second and successor phase of a government-backed initiative to increase the number of women, not just on FTSE-listed boards, but on in the leadership layers, two layers down below the board. So we track and monitor every year around 23,000 of arguably the UK's biggest business roles, and what the gender representation is in those roles over time. We started at 9% a decade ago, and today are around somewhere between 35%, depending on quite which population you look at. So great progress, but a long way to go.
Much more to do. We'll be looking at more detail of that later, Denise. David.
Hi, I'm David Hughes. I'm Chief Executive of the Association of Colleges. We represent all of the general FE and sixth form colleges in England. We've got, I suppose, about 2.2 million students in those colleges, and more women than men, interestingly. We're also sort of flavour of the month for government, so right at the heart of their policy agenda. So there's some interesting trends there we might come back to later. Overall, colleges employ about 61% women. 48% of college leaders are women, which is, is kind of not bad. But I think underlying all of that, there's some really big questions about, what women are studying, what careers they're going into, and what their job outcomes and wage outcomes are. And particularly with COVID, some really interesting trends we can talk about around sectors as well.
Thank you, David. And Cindy.
So I'm Cindy Rampersaud, and I lead the BTEC and Apprenticeships business at Pearson. And I think the importance of this subject is twofold, really. The first bit, I guess, in terms of what we do, in terms of the development of learning and curriculum. I think one aspect is making sure that that we're actually thinking of the needs of young women in school, but also women in the workplace. And I think as we move forward, we know that most careers or most industries will be touched by technology and digital, and typically they are not the subjects that girls go into. So there's an element of how do we encourage through careers advice and guidance. And then I think thinking about older women and women in through their careers is how they continue to access those careers, how they're retained in businesses. So really making sure that learning is relevant in terms of design and access to really support progression for young women, but also those already in their careers.
Super, thank you, Cindy, and thank you very much, panel, for those introductions. Denise, if we could kickstart with yourself, if that's okay. Can you tell us a bit about the impact you've seen with COVID having on women in terms of their access to learning, the labour market, and more generally their well-being?
Yeah, well, look, I think we knew from the off that the impact of this was not going to be equal over different segments of society, and indeed we've seen that play out. From a learning perspective, I would say that many women, particularly those with caring responsibilities or with school-aged children, have typically been in survival mode and not much more. Particularly those that are in a dual role of having to home educate and try and keep their job going at the same time, some key workers. There's been very little capacity for self-development for many women in those categories. And I think, if you look at certain sectors, let's take the hospitality sector, then a lot of young women go into hospitality. Around a third of the hospitality sector is made up of women, and particularly young women, a first job, a second job, and the skills that they gain through that, not just the hard technical skills, the kind of career progression, the social skills they learn. They've just been at home on furlough and missed that opportunity. So in terms of learning, I think it has, women particularly been very hard hit. The labour market you asked about, when we published our report last year, we saw very clearly that there was a flattening off of progression of women through what we call the direct reports, which is that those senior leaders just below the board. And typically we'd see about 3% progression there. And last year, for the first time in many, many years, there was very little increase in the number of women serving in those roles. Again, just sticking with the hospitality sector, it's lost around 2 million people from that sector, and it's made up of 60% women. So the differential impact on women, because the hospitality sector has been very hardly hit, will be felt. Some of those industries that are hardest hit are stopped by women. And we know that many furlough schemes have not yet ended, and when they do, the estimate is around 15% of people currently on furlough will not have a job at the end. Again, many women. Well-being, I think the consequential impact of all of this is obvious. Burnout, stress, that extra burden that seems to fall unequally on women in terms of needing to educate at home, stress levels. We're hearing a huge amount of anecdotal evidence from women in terms of the impact this has taken. And I honestly think that we have a generation or two of women that we just need to give some extra support, extra care, and boost through all of this, because recovery, transition back into the workplace, back to normal, will be a long haul for many.
We were making great progress in business and society around the gender gap pre-COVID. Why is it so important that we address this issue now and the impact of COVID? Surely could this be sort of like a negative 18 months that will correct itself naturally over the next 2 years, or do we need to take big proactive action as a society to address this issue now? What would be the impact if we did nothing?
Well, look, I think absolutely the latter, Shane. We were struggling to make really fast and strong progress prior to COVID. So COVID is a at best standstill, if not a significant setback for the progression of women. And women make up 50% of the population, 50% of our workforce, over 50% of our university leavers, our qualified accountants and lawyers today. And yet, we are at risk of ignoring almost half of the population. And there's very different, diverse inputs that are needed in any team in order to give stronger, better performance. And the waste of not just individual talent, but the waste of the economic waste of that for the underemployment of women, people who are capable, qualified, but held back through either they don't get picked with bias in the selection process, gender stereotyping, lack of affordable childcare, unequal burden of domestic responsibilities. We are just not, as a country, making the most of that. We used to, when we started this review a decade ago, we talked only about the business case, in part because we were trying to convince senior white males who didn't really want to hear about the unequal effect on women. They just wanted to hear about the pounds, shillings and pence. And we made that case. We didn't talk about fairness, but actually, equal opportunity and fairness is something we should all be proud to be pushing for today, as well as the economic benefit that comes with accessing the whole of our workforce in the UK, not just half of it.
It's crazy that you even have to say that, Denise. I'll wholeheartedly agree. David, I want to focus a bit more on the learning side of all of this. You know, in your role as CEO of the Association of Colleges, you are dealing with a multitude of colleges and other education providers, but also working closely with government and also employers. What sort of experiences have you heard in terms of the impact COVID has had on the learning of women, both young and older women? You're on mute, David.
Building a lot on what Denise has said, actually, because I think that was a fantastic overview, which so I don't want to kind of repeat stuff, but trying to build on it a bit. If you look at the sectors that have been hit most in the pandemic, you know, hospitality and retail probably are the worst too. Disproportionate numbers of women, disproportionate numbers of part-time workers, disproportionate numbers of people with low-level qualifications, not necessarily low-level skills, but low-level qualifications. For a lot of those people, they're not going to go back into the sector they were in. And they face, I think, that difficult challenge of understanding what skills they've got, what abilities they've got, which are transferable to another sector. And I think there's a bit of, I don't want to generalize too much, but I mean, I think that some of the evidence sessions we've been doing in the review with Pearson shows that probably women tend to be less confident about the skills they've got and asserting what they've got in a different sector than men. And it's not universally true, but I'm sure it's kind of generally true. And what we need to therefore do is provide advice to people about the skills they've already got, even if they haven't got an A-level or a BTEC or a degree, to be able to go confidently into another sector and to give them the understanding of what skills those new sectors are looking at. But it's quite a big ask and quite a big jump because, you know, again, lots of people in retail hospitality without good qualifications at higher levels, whereas most of the growth sectors require qualifications at higher levels. You know, if you think about health, think about engineering, think about digital and cyber, you know, those are the sort of sectors where actually you do need quite high technical skills to get decent jobs in them. So there's a really big job to support people to be able to move confidently, get the advice, get the confidence, and also gain the skills. And I don't think the skills system the government has set up delivers that at the moment. And we're pushing on the skills bill for it to be able to pick up people who might be unemployed, who need the support, maintenance support, to be able to do those qualifications to get those jobs. Otherwise, I think we will see more and more women pushed into even more marginal jobs because they don't have those qualifications.
For the women that you know, Denise alluded to some of them, a particular group of women that were employed pre-pandemic, perhaps in the hospitality sector and others that have now been on furlough, say 12, 18 months, or have been made redundant. What role does education have in terms of picking them up, both from a learning perspective, but also from a wellness and confidence, which you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, well, I think it's, I mean, I use the word confidence, but, you know, wellness is probably a better word. I mean, I think having the confidence that after 12, 18 months of furlough, probably, as Denise said, where you've been doing more of the home caring, more of the homeschooling, and going out into the labour market, I think is a really big ask, actually. And I don't think we've got the system to be able to support people yet. I'd love to see more funding coming into colleges and other providers to be able to do that kind of work. You know, it's partly employment advice and it's partly some of that skills refresh. Because I suspect lots of those women will have lots of skills, but they won't be certificated. They might not recognise them themselves. So they might need a bit of top up. They might need to be able to do a certificate or an award to be able to show an employer. They might be able to have to do a module that's important within that certain sector. And actually, we know that as soon as people are given that first taste of learning, they often kind of fly. You know, you're unstoppable. But actually, it's that first step that matters so much. And we're at a point, aren't we, where we could just ignore it and hope that it all sorts out, as you were alluding, or we could grasp the nettle and say, here's a fantastic opportunity to change things. And I just hope we do the latter.
Fingers crossed. The employers that your members are, you know, dealing with on a daily basis, are they expressing their sensitivities towards this issue? Are employers being proactive at this time with colleges?
I think it's hard to say. I mean, look, we reckon colleges work with about 200,000 SMEs. there are 6 million. So even if they are, I think there's a lot to get to. And I think there are, and again, Denise sort of covered this a bit, I think there are lots of very, dinosaur views amongst, probably particularly white men in senior positions about, working practice, about job design, about what sorts of skills you look for, about the stereotypes around the people you look for when you're recruiting. And there's a lot of change that needs to happen. I mean, I'm particularly worried that it's all very well to sort of say to people, we can have this hybrid working practice where people are working at home. And there are lots of problems with that. If women are doing more of the caring and more of the sort of homeschooling and so on, that means it's a double burden on them. And actually, they'd probably be better off getting into the office, or into the workplace. So that's one issue. But the other issue is that I still think there's a perception that it's okay to do flexible working and part-time up to a certain point. But then when you get to a certain point of seniority, you have to be serious about the job and you have to do 100 hours a week. And again, I don't think that's true. And I think it's a real barrier actually to proper equality for men and women all the way through the levels and careers.
Cindy, just expanding on David's points around the importance of learning, you're a senior leader in a FTSE 100 company, so one of the big ones in our country. But also you're in charge of a huge director of qualifications within Pearson as an awarding organisation. So to you, what is the importance of learning within tackling the gender pay gap, or the gender gap, sorry?
I mean, I think it's crucial. And I think actually learning per se, going forward post-COVID, with it's a changing landscape and the impact of technology, but also changing industries that I talked about earlier. And I think, David talked about AI and cyber and digital. If those are going to be the new roles of the future, I think it's making sure that we've got learning that is aligned to those sectors that are emerging. So you'll know that, the way BTEC is organised, it's across different sector verticals. And I think the key thing is to look at what those emerging verticals are, look at what the gaps are by working with employers, understanding what the skills are, but also understanding what the gaps are that they've got in their kind of workforce, both in terms of entry level, but also in terms of how they retain talent, how they upskill talent, and then really designing the learning, I think, to suit the needs of the learners. So for me, this builds on some of what David's talked about, which is it needs to be accessible, it needs to be relevant. And accessible, I think, is also about not just the time and how and whether you do it on your mobile phone. It's also accessible in terms of confidence, because if you have worked in a particular industry in retail on the high street for a number of years, your retailer has moved completely online. So I think there are a number that have. So I think Whistles have completely gone online from a high street model. There's still a demand for staff in that industry, many of whom are women. So the workforce is predominantly women. You want to be able to transition those women to still be able to support the customers and support your business. But that means giving them the kind of confidence, I think, to access the learning in a way that kind of helps them to progress. So I think this point about confidence is really important around learning and continual learning. But I also want to come back to I think our responsibility as a sector with learning and learning content is not just about when women are in the workforce and how we support them as we come out of COVID. It's about addressing what could be storing up to be a problem in 10 years' time, which is if young girls don't access STEM subjects, aren't enthused by STEM subjects because they're not encouraged to be enthused, that actually they're not going to be able to access those careers. And I think some of that is about careers advice and guidance. I think some of it is about confidence again. Some of it is about tackling some of the inbuilt biases and prejudice about what subjects girls do versus boys. And I think, organisations like Speakers for School and employers coming in and role modelling, I think is really, really important. So I think it's the education piece, but it's also the awareness, which should be part of the education piece and bringing it to life.
Right, I've got about 5 follow-up questions for you, Cindy, but I can't focus on you, so I'm going to focus on one. And this is for both David and Cindy, actually, this one. You talk around accessibility of education. And David mentioned earlier around actually being at home and home working actually maybe isn't very helpful in terms of developing women's confidence and their role within the workforce. Do you as educators have to be sensitive to that as well in terms of the provision of home learning going forward? Because both of your organisations, or certainly your members, David, are all looking at the opportunity for home learning. Actually, could that be a real negative? Could that have a negative consequence, an unintended consequence?
Yeah, and I think, it's funny because I always say that the key bit around learning that makes the difference is the enrichment piece. And the enrichment piece is invariably the bit that is about interaction and application. So I think, just doing learning, just working in isolation could be really difficult. And I know Denise has got many views on this in terms of visibility of women in the workplace as well, and what that might mean for progression. So I think designing the learning in a way that is applied, that is interactive, that creates networks. In some instances, it's blended. In some instances, it includes a project that might be involved actually working with an employer. David talked about the number of SMEs that we've got in our country. So I think it's going to be about thinking about what that learning looks like. But I think bite size is also good because bite size is not a big, long program. And I think that's the other thing we have to do is get ourselves away from thinking that a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old woman wants to go and do a 1-year or 2-year BTEC program. They don't actually, or a City and Guilds program. They probably just need to do that bite size. And actually there's less isolation there, but it's about being able to reach out and get the help where you need it. So, but of course it's something we have to be acutely aware of in everything we do going forward, not just in education.
And David?
Yeah, look, I think surely the one thing we've learned from the pandemic is that we all want to meet each other. We all want to come together. I mean, it is quite nice and it's very efficient doing things online, but it's not sufficient, and it's not very nourishing. So, and I've always believed that learning is a social experience. It's about being with other people, all being learners. So the labels about whether you're rich or poor, whether you're black or white, whether you're a prisoner or not, I mean, one of the beauties of doing work in prisons is prisoners saying, I'm a learner today, I'm not a prisoner. There's something incredibly important about labeling yourself as something. I'm not a mother, I'm not a woman, I'm not I am a learner is really important, and I'm with other learners and I'm equal to them. And I will build social networks, and I will build, support from people. I'll recognise I'm not the only one who's frightened by exams or tests. I'm not the only one who's struggling with this bit of maths or this bit of the course. So I think the social side of it is absolutely essential. But actually, most colleges, I think, are looking at blended. As Cindy said, that trying to not just blended, which is we'll do some of it in a classroom and some of it online, but just thinking about, well, what is it about coming together that's so important? Because it's not necessarily sitting at a desk, being taught, but it is about other things that you do, the enrichment and the engagement and the socializing, and maybe therefore being much cleverer about how you split learning so that you get literally the best of both worlds. Because there's all sorts of evidence as well, of course, that being able to sort of stop a video if it's asynchronous and to be able to then go back and repeat it is also really powerful. If you just don't get something, you can stop and go back. And you can't do that in a classroom very easily. So I think the blended approach is really, really important. But more than anything, though, I think for me the big issue is about where people go to get advice and where they go to get the confidence that they can move on, rather than they're stuck, and I think that's the thing that we should be focusing on most.
And Denise, where at the moment in the workplace, where do women tend to go? Where for role model for a role model or for some general advice?
Well, look, I mean, I think everybody looks up in their organisation to see who's on the next level, particularly a level that is fairly close to you, is very persuasive. They look And that, that's the importance of role models, actually, and that's why it's really important to have women at every stage in the career that women can look up to. And in the past, I think there were so few women that getting real advice and support from other women, particularly more senior women, was often hard. But that's changed rapidly in the last few years. And many, many women are now reaching down to younger women in the workplace in order to share their advice, make it easier for them on this journey, do what they can to help and support other women, as are men. And I think, I think it's typically you look within your workplace, within your sector, this confidence we often hear about of that maybe women lack, which actually I don't buy into. Most of the women that I know don't lack confidence. What it is when they look up, they don't see people who look like them. They see a cohort of leaders that look, think, act, talk, speak, dress differently to them. And it's a lack of confidence in the organisation, not a lack of confidence in themselves, which leads them to think they don't fit. There isn't a place for them or people like me, and they leave or just put their head down and work in a role that is below their capacity.
Whose responsibility is it, or what help is there for those in power at the moment, those senior white middle-class men, and helping them to be an enabler of women and empowering women to rise up through the ranks, so to speak?
That is such a great question, because there's not a huge amount out there. One of my big campaigns and things that I'm working on is trying to educate men and actually as well as some women, but in the value of gender diversity and in how to manage, how to inspire, how to handle people who are in your team, in your sphere of influence, who have grown up with a very different set of life experiences to you. How a senior white man speaks to a young black man. How a senior white man speaks to a young woman who's just returned from maternity leave, and empathetically, supportively, helpfully. And we have a dearth of formal education in the business space on how to do that. A lot of it ends up being one-on-one support and coaching. I will have men who will say to me, well, I've got daughters, I've got a wife, so I know all about this subject. Actually, it is much, much more complex and complicated than that, as we are now learning, a decade on this journey. But if I could have one little splash of fairy dust, it would be to make handling the gender differences a core competency and part of leadership training in the workforce. There is a mirror of information, great reports, some of which Pearson have done in the past, KPMG, PwC, McKinsey's, any of those big names you wish to mention in the business space, almost one a year, every single firm, professional firm, will publish something on gender differences and the importance of them. Who reads them? I think not enough people. And that is a big issue for the next 5 years we've got to tackle: information and support.
And I think that should be extended, Denise, to other underrepresented groups as a competence.
Yes, no, absolutely. And when I'm talking about women, because that is the particular focus today, but it applies equally to all underrepresented groups. You're right.
David and Cindy, can I just pick up on that point of discussion? What are colleges, educators doing to educate young men around equality between the different genders? David?
Yeah, before I answer that, I just want to pick up this issue about the how to talk to empathetically, which I completely agree with. There's also a why to, isn't there? Why what's driving you? And I think my view's always been that I might not necessarily get this right when I'm talking to a woman, or a woman returning from maternity leave, or someone of colour. But you know what? My intention is to try and make the workplace work for them, and therefore I might get the words wrong, or I might, say something that I shouldn't say. But actually, my intent is to try and maintain the talent in the organisation, support people to further their careers, and that's always got to be at the forefront. I think that's not true of a lot of leaders. I just think a lot of leaders don't think it's important enough. So that diversity for a better kind of set of talent, and that diversity of voice and thinking, I think has to be valued as well. Because I think often people use the "I don't know how to do this" as an excuse, rather than that being the reason. I've sometimes got stumbled over things and kind of made mistakes. Of course I have, and I'll probably always go on doing that. But I think deep down, the drive for inclusion kind of overcomes that, and that's what we need to inculcate. Look, there's so much to say on this, isn't there? I mean, the Ofsted sort of rapid review on sexual abuse in schools and colleges just published a couple of weeks ago. I was on the reference group for it, and I don't think you can read that report and what they found, and other reports, by the way, without just shaking your head about how bad our culture is as a society in the way gender works out. So 90% of young women were saying that it's just normal to get new text sent to you. 90%. The recording and reporting of so what might be called low-level sexual harassment. It's just sexual harassment. It was just horrible. And so there's an enormous job for education to do with boys from the earliest ages all the way through to their teens, about culture, about respect, about understanding what it means to be a male and what it means to really absolutely respect women in our society. And I don't think that exists. And I do think deep down that's the problem that we're kind of describing in the workplace and in the labour market, that it comes from that very deep kind of cultural things that you learn as a child. And so I think as an education system, we've got to address that. We've got to create cultures in schools and colleges that absolutely model proper respect for each other, understanding of different genders, understanding of different sexualities, understanding of different race, different views, etc., and the diversity around it. It's a very long-term societal issue, and it's not just education that can solve it. Education's got to be at the heart of it.
To the three of you, do you think this is an issue with young people, something that with this new generation coming through, it's increasingly becoming a problem? So we're seeing a rise in hate crime, seeing a rise in racism, homophobia, gender discrimination, and general harassment, as David just alluded to. I'm 30, and I feel that my generation, certainly those in their 20s, made great progress compared, going through my schooling. Racism wasn't really a thing, thankfully, nor was homophobia. I came out gay, got full support unanimously from most people. But you're now seeing some younger people that, family, friends and stuff. I'm seeing gender discrimination. I'm seeing homophobia again. I'm seeing racism. And then we see what's happening in, say, the sporting communities. Why are we seeing this sudden shift against difference?
Can I come in on the piece on education and because I think there is a shift and I think David's point about it's broader than education is true. I think social media, technology, which we keep talking about, just changes the dynamics, and actually many of us are kind of catching up with that at an adult level compared to young people. So I think there's all the stuff around broader society and responsibility around things like social media and the like. But I also think there's a bigger piece here around education. So, we've got a brilliant editorial policy, which we're incredibly proud of, which is all about promoting inclusivity and making sure everything we kind of design has inclusivity at the heart of it. And I think that's great. But I also think when you look at our education system, and I always say I've been in it 10 years now, we're very academic focused. We're all about outcomes that are about grades. Enrichment is less and less part of the curriculum. And enrichment is the bit that teaches many kids how to interact with each other, teamwork, networking. And I wonder whether, as we look at the curriculum of the future, what we should be thinking about is how we embed those human elements, those kind of values David talked about, which is, you know, about respect, about empathy, about the impact you have on each other and your kind of peers. And I think it is from early years, but it isn't just early years, because we do a lot of nurturing at the early years, and then we go down this really, you know, very kind of academic route, where it's about outcomes, and actually in their teenage years, this is probably where kids and young people need some of this. I also think, you know, PSHE, David will correct me if I've kind of got it wrong, but, you know, does that curriculum need to be looked at? It's not purely probably about the birds and the bees and sex education. I'm sure it's moved on considerably, and as somebody in education, I should know, but actually, is it broader about kind of social media and respect and care? And I think this isn't just the gender issue, as you said, Shane. This is also about, you know, just difference, actually just respecting difference. So I think it's broader than education, but I think there is something about the design that should mean that it's more about understanding and the human bit coming into it, would be my view.
Thank you. Denise, I want to focus a little bit on STEM, because it's always the one that's leaned upon as a nice example, demonstrate, you know, a lack of women, an imbalance. Is it true? Is that still really the case, or is that, you know, has there been significant improvement in the past decade?
Look, I'd say there's been a marginal improvement, but not a significant improvement.
Why is it so bad in STEM? Because it feels, you know, this is something we've been talking about when I remember, you know, this being talked about when I was at school nearly 20 years ago. You know, this encouragement to get girls, you know, encourage young women to study science GCSEs, for example, in the hope they go on to a career in STEM. Why is it so poor in STEM areas still?
I think there's just a huge amount of unhelpful gender stereotyping that goes on, and it starts very early on, as we know. It starts in early years, and is particularly reinforced through peer groups, and I, you know, I think education has worked pretty hard to dismantle some of those stereotypes, but we've still got a very long way to go on that. And it's, yeah, I think it's But you know, what I would like to say is that, and I think David touched on that earlier, it isn't only about STEM. There are, you know, what we want to do is get women into big jobs in leadership. It doesn't really matter, shouldn't really matter what discipline they come up through. Clearly, we want to see more women in STEM. And we are actually, technology is the one area where I think there has been great progress in IT. Science a little bit more so. I'm hoping that through COVID, one of the beneficial factors coming out of that is that it will inspire more women to go into the medical profession, into science, into scientific research. So there is already a sign of greater interest in young women in those areas through the experiences of COVID. But, you know, it's about big leadership roles. It doesn't really matter what industry it's in, but what we do need to do is get more women at the decision-making table, have more women, as we said, as role models, more women who are able to influence and change the cultures, who are challenging the decisions made by often all male, very similar types, very similar backgrounds around the table, reinforcing one another's viewpoints and giving a sense of force, bravado and self and security. And we need women who are prepared to. We need women to sit at the table, because more often than not, they are prepared to challenge. But you know, it is all about cultural change, because we're starting to see a backlash on that. And many of the women who've taken on those leadership roles, who are now sitting at the top table, are being slightly marginalised, because actually that's quite uncomfortable for those that have sat there and maintained the status quo for many years. So we need a business, we need a society that is much, much more accepting of difference and change and challenge. And this is all part of modernising the workplace, modernising society that we live in. And, you know, as I said at the very beginning, we've still got a long, long way to go. We're just beginning to peel back the layers of that onion and see how complex this topic is.
Have we seen a suspension of businesses' efforts in terms of communicating the importance of diversity of their workforce? I just think here's some examples of friends of mine that work in large organisations. You know, in the last 18 months, have had a complete suspension of any equality and diversity training, all of that sort of stuff. They just stopped because they said, you know, as a business, we need to focus elsewhere.
Well, look, I think there's been good examples and there's been poor examples of that. And one of the very helpful things that has come out of this is that it has shone a rather harsh spotlight on those employers in whatever sector you are who care very little about what we call ESG, environment, social governance. Everybody's very clear about environmental impact that business can have and the governance impact that business can have, that businesses need to pay attention to. The social bit was missing, and I think COVID has helped shine a spotlight on how organisations treat their staff and their people, and there have been some really fantastic examples of support of people who have struggled, being given sabbaticals, told they can come back to their same job, much more agile, flexible working. Some people who sat at home and have absolutely thrived through not being in what is often quite a brutal environment actually in the workplace, but being able to work on their own, being able to speak by putting their hands up on a piece of technology, they have actually come to the fore. And others who are always trying to dominate and get the space have not done quite so well. So I think it has had a differential impact actually. But there are sort of winners and losers, I would say, on who's looking good in this space. But what I do hope is that all people, particularly youngsters, start to look at this. They start to pay attention to how they're treated as an employee. And I think there's been insufficient attention from young people, universities, etc., on the vast difference of employers in terms of welfare treatment of employees.
I wonder if you could just expand a little bit on something we touched on earlier, which was around the different socioeconomic groupings and the impact from a gender perspective there, but also looking at it from a sector basis. Are there particular areas you're really concerned about in terms of the balance of women?
It's interesting. We used to think the sector was huge, that we would find very little progression in mining, in extractives, in oil and gas, in heavy industry, and that financial services, those typical office-based roles, would do very well. When we started this, actually, it seems to be sector agnostic. What matters most is the leader of that organisation. We have seen probably one of our most shining examples of making progress in all areas of gender equality is a mining, BHP Billiton, a mining company. And, if you can do it in mining, you can do it in an insurance company, in an office down the road in the city. The key difference was the leader. And going back to something David said earlier, do they care about this? Is it authentic, or have they just learned the right words from their PR team? And that's why the importance of monitoring and capturing the data and reporting on it year on year is so important, because there is now nowhere to hide. We're publishing every single year the progression that these companies are making in terms of women's representation and leadership. And many are talking a great story, but when you run the slide rule across, they've gone nowhere. And investors are noticing that, as are employees, and starting to call that
out. Your review set a target of a third, which you mentioned earlier. Where did that figure come from? Is a third good enough? Should that target now be raised? It looked pre-COVID, across the FTSE 100, 250, 350, those figures were broadly achieved. Is it time to set the bar higher?
Absolutely, it is time to set the bar higher. We're currently working with government on what the next 5 years looks like. For my money, this should be gender equality next. The first 5 years was about 25% women. The second 5 years was about 33% women. And why would we not absolutely be pitching for gender equality? Look, I don't think that needs to be a magic number of 50%. But we all know when we walk into a room, sit at a table, go to a dinner party, go anywhere, what the gender balance generally is in a room. And we know when it's right and we know when it's wrong. So somewhere around 40% minimum of either gender feels about right, allowing some flexibility. But 10 years on, it feels like we should absolutely be now on the final straight of getting women equally represented in the workplace, in every sector, in education, in business, in public office, in government. But we know on the back of that there's still a big job to do in terms of inclusion, in terms of creating really inclusive cultures where everybody feels they fit and can give of their all. But unless we've got fair representation, then it's very difficult to get started on that inclusion route.
David, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think I'm right in saying that, for the FE sector, for colleges in particular, it's a great success story in terms of gender representation at a senior level. Forgive me, I don't know about the wider workforce, but certainly from a senior level, I remember, it being dominated by men. And now I think, over half of senior leaders in FE, certainly at a principal level, are women. How has that been achieved?
It's a very good question. I don't know. I mean, I think, interestingly, I don't think there was ever any conscious effort to make that happen. I think the figures are 61% of the workforce is women, and it's 48% of leaders currently. So, I mean, 48% of 200 or so. I mean, it's pretty good. And senior management, see, I don't go to any colleges where there isn't a really good mix in the senior management team and on boards, and we're doing a lot of work on board recruitment and as well, because that's really, really critical around gender and around race and other issues. So I don't really know. I mean, I think the thing I really wanted to pick up was around apprenticeships, which really worries me, because I think everything Denise said is really good in terms of, and I completely agree, it comes down to, does the chief exec want this to happen, and do they make it happen? And that can be sector agnostic. But at the same time, if you look at apprenticeship recruitment, it's incredibly stereotyped. Care is 90% women, construction is 90% men, and there's been no movement whatsoever in that. And I've always thought that, particularly when apprenticeships was mainly about SMEs, it isn't anymore, of course, but I always thought that it reflected the bias in the labour market and inflated it even further, that all the labour market prejudice and bias kind of plays through apprenticeships, and the government does nothing about it. The government must use apprenticeship programme to overcome the prejudices, the bias, the stereotyping, and to get better equality, but it never has done. What it keeps doing is saying it's up to employers. Well, that's okay, but let's actually make it much easier for employers to do the right thing, and let's not let them do the wrong thing. So they could use it to target, they could use it to improve the numbers of certain, whether it's around gender or race in certain sectors, because they're big issues. But it keeps just refusing to do that. And it's public money, and it should be the public purpose to improve equality and diversity and inclusion. But so we need to get to the government and just get them to do it. And I am incredibly worried about the use of the apprenticeship levy. I'm almost certain that if we ever see the full figures, that will show that it's more men in more senior positions benefiting, in a sense, at the expense of, young women, young black people who aren't getting into the apprenticeships to start their career. And I think all of that imbalance is imbalanced and is wrong, and we've got to do something about it.
Cindy, do you want to come in on that conversation, particularly around apprenticeships?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with David completely. I think, the use of the apprenticeship levy for higher level degrees of people who are already successful in their careers, is questionable, when actually we're talking about a kind of pipeline of talent and kind of upskilling and moving people through their career. So I think David is right that there are instances where I think the spirit of how the apprenticeship levy is being used is probably questionable. I think in terms of what the government can do, or what we can be looking to do, I think it's not just with the levy, but also things like the Kickstart programme. And this came up at the forum that we had a week ago or 2 weeks ago. I've kind of lost track of time, where some of the witnesses were talking about, actually, as David said, is there an opportunity to actually incentivize employers to think about using some of their levy for attracting a more diverse talent pool into their organization, because actually that's in the interest of their business in terms of productivity. The stats speak for themselves, and it's the right thing to do. So I wonder whether some of the targeting, some of the data needs to go down to another granular level, and there needs to be some accountability around DE&I and how that fits with talent and talent strategies in large organizations in particular. Harder to do probably in some of the smaller SMEs, but Denise will kind of have more of a view on that, maybe challenge me if I've got that wrong, but yeah, I think that there is an opportunity.
Denise, my understanding is your review has had much more of a focus on leadership roles. Have you looked at learning and the role of learning on this? Particularly, I guess, let's pick up on David and Cindy's discussions around apprenticeships, and they could, arguably be a really important feeder of women into certain sectors.
Yeah, look, the review is specifically focused on leadership and leadership development and increasing the representation of women in that cohort. But of course, you're right, that unless you're looking all the way through the pipeline and right down to the very bottom, and actually prior to that, into how views are fashioned, how careers are understood in education itself, and the gender stereotyping issues you've already touched on, you've got to look the whole way through. You can't just look at the very top. Maternity is huge, obviously, on this subject, and ensuring that there's affordable childcare, and we've seen the impact of that through COVID. What happens when children are suddenly turned home? And for many women, childcare in this country is just unaffordable, and that has an impact too. So involving men more in the home, involving men more in family learning and education. Why is it that learning and education is deemed automatically to be the role of the woman? How do we get dads and young men more involved in the domestic burden, but also teaching and learning of the children? I think is a big opportunity for us going forward. This is multifaceted, multi-layered, and you need to have programs, approaches, inputs. Be pushing it at all levels. It's a complex issue, and far more complex than we ever imagined a decade ago.
Absolutely, and far more complex than to fit it into a 50-minute discussion between the four of us. So, but just in the final couple of minutes that we've got, Cindy, you and the fellow panelists have referred to this forum that Pearson are currently running. Can you say a bit more about it and why the focus specifically on women?
Yeah, so it's not just on women. So I think it was the back end of last year. We were looking at stats and the kind of media that was talking about the impact COVID was having on really a cross section of society that was disproportionate. Women, Black and ethnic minority individuals, young people, regional variations, and we wanted to do a piece of work to really look at the impact of COVID and that widening inequality gap, but actually more importantly, look at what's been the impact, but what is it that we need to do now to act now to make sure that gap is reduced over time? Because there's two elements, isn't there, that we've talked about already. One is the kind of fiscal piece, and I think that the chief economist of the Bank of England referred to that if this isn't dealt with, that it would be, the fiscal impact would be huge in terms of the economy going forward. But there's also the kind of moral impact. And so we wanted to do a piece of work now to kind of highlight it, but also to say, how does learning and skills fit into this, and how can it be a real enabler? And Anne Milton is doing a fantastic job of chairing it, and Denise and David are both part of the forum. So we're kind of publishing some of the findings as we go, and there's a final report coming out in October or November, I think.
And for the audience watching home, is there a particular way they can get involved or support you in your mission here?
Yeah, there's a website, and I can send it to you afterwards, the link, and you can put it where they can find out about the content. And also we're posting all of the time on social media, and we're getting some really fantastic evidence from individuals, some real human personal stories that we're also sharing to kind of bring this to life.
Super. And quickly, David and Denise, we've got 51 seconds remaining. What are you hoping to see this project achieve? If you have 30 seconds each. David first.
I think it's got to shine a light on inequality to make every one of us think about what we're doing about it. Government, colleges, employers, the lot.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. And Denise?
Yeah, absolutely. Nobody's really talking about this. I think we need the facts out there of the differential impact that COVID has had, and then we need it to be solutions orientated. So it needs action, and it needs money, policies, government support, business support behind it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cindy, Denise and David. Stay tuned. We've got Her Majesty Chief Inspector Amanda Spielman addressing the conference in about half an hour's time. And then following Amanda, we've got a keynote address from Women Ed, a series of senior leaders in education, which are all women talking about women being disruptors, innovators and change makers. Thank you very much, everybody. Take care.
It's my great honour to welcome you